Okay, let's get started. My name is Clay Josephi. I'm with Tahoe Emergency Physicians and Barton Health Systems. I'm a attending emergency physician in the emergency department at the hospital here in town. I'm also an avid backcountry skier, and today we're going to talk about avalanche medicine. Our objectives today are basically we want to review the pathomechanisms of avalanche fatalities, specifically how do patients die in avalanches, because in order to save their lives, we want to know as much as we can about the mechanisms by which they die. We also want to introduce a little bit about avalanche rescue and specifically how can we position ourselves and prepare ourselves and use the right tools and technologies to locate these avalanche victims and perhaps save their lives. We also want to, therefore, discuss a little bit about the complexities of a medical scenario in an avalanche victim, because this is a very unique and sort of exotic way to die, and being buried in an avalanche carries all sorts of specific and unique medical characteristics to the scenario. So today, I just want to start by saying I have no financial disclosures, and I also want to state that dying in an avalanche is an exotic and very rare event. If you add up all the avalanche deaths that are reported throughout the world, you're still talking about an exceedingly unlikely way to go. But it really depends on where you live and where you work. And we live here in Tahoe, and we work in Tahoe, and we actually get out in the backcountry a lot. There are a number of backcountry users in this community, people who are young and active and like to snowboard and backcountry ski and snowmobile and hike and snowshoe. And because of that, we actually tend to see a lot of avalanche incidents and sometimes even fatalities in our local area. So we want to know as much as we can about this, and so we're going to share a little bit about this topic that's so important to us. We're not going to really get into avalanche physics today, but suffice it to say that snow builds up over the course of the winter in different snow layers and forms different strata of snow as it falls, and the interfaces between these strata have different bonding strengths, and eventually you might develop a weak layer underneath that snow that, given the right circumstances and the right loading, may fail and fracture, causing a massive amount of snow and disastrous forces to tumble down the mountainside. Here's a before and after picture. You can see the results of a very large avalanche that basically tore down this entire forest of full-grown trees. It's really quite a monumental and catastrophic force. So as I stated, we live here in Tahoe, and just to kind of bring this a little bit home, this was an avalanche that was triggered by a skier just last spring up just on the North Shore. This was, I believe, the sixth or seventh skier to go through this terrain, and somehow hit the right trigger point, and there was a reactive weak layer, and he and this particular skier was carried downhill quite a ways and was only partially buried and was able to self-extricate, and there were no injuries, thankfully. This is a fairly large avalanche, certainly large enough to bury and kill a skier. This is another local event. This was a bit tragic. This was actually at the ski resort, you can see, and some partners took a path that had not been prepared yet. This was early season. There was a big heavy snowstorm, and they had this part of the mountain was closed, and it had not been prepared, and they dropped in there and triggered this large slab avalanche, and the victim was fully buried and did not have a transceiver, and was found a couple of days later by rescue teams under the snow. So that was a sad one. This is a particularly memorable avalanche. This is a large dry slab avalanche that I was actually party to. One of the members of my party triggered this and was partially buried and partially pinned up against these trees that you can see in the right-hand picture. The lighting is terrible, but those are fragments of slab avalanche and piles of debris that had built up around the trees. So very close call. this was one of my personal experiences. So this is a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts. Okay, so how do patients die in avalanches? This is the question that we want to address today and get a firm grasp on, so that we can understand the importance of both rescue techniques, how do we localize and extricate these victims, and then how do we address them once we do find them medically. So this is the classic avalanche survival curve. This was generated from Canadian and Swiss data. And looking at the survival curve, this is a plot of probability of survival versus duration of burial and time of burial. And as you can see from the curve, survivability drops off precipitously, and does so in a very fast and very sobering manner. There's a couple things that we want to focus on this curve. If you look in the first 10 minutes, and actually the first couple of minutes, you see there's a precipitous drop in survival, and this is due to trauma. So a lot of people, once they are avalanched and they're being carried downhill in the large debris and maybe carried through trees or over cliffs, about 20% of people die within the first couple of minutes from traumatic injuries. And that, this curve is an interesting one. It does actually bring up some controversies because the Canadian and Swiss mortalities from trauma are markedly different. So that's why there's two different curves. But just note that within the first couple of minutes, or certainly within the first 10 minutes, you're looking at 20% mortality, which is overwhelmingly due to trauma in the accident. So that's the first thing. So trauma. If you look at the next phase of the curve, you see a slightly less precipitous, but still quite steep drop off in survivability over the next 10 to 20 minutes. And this is the rate of death during the second phase of the curve is attributable to the fact that these patients are asphyxiating, they're suffocating, their airways are packed, and they are unable to oxygenate and ventilate. And the rate at which this occurs is dependent completely on whether or not you have an air pocket. So you can see after 30 minutes, mortality is almost 3/4. So that just tells you right off the bat that we need to, if we want to impact the outcome of these patients, we need to get to them quickly. And then so that's the first thing that we wanted to kind of focus on in terms of looking at this avalanche curve and just looking how quickly and by which mechanisms people die. This infographics generated from, I believe, U.S. and Canadian data, basically stating that 23% of people die from trauma, 66% die from asphyxia during that second drop-off phase of the curve, and then a very small proportion of patients end up surviving the asphyxia phase beyond 30 minutes and end up dying of hypothermia, hypoxemia, and cardiopulmonary arrest. Okay, so let's go back to the avalanche curve and just look at this one more time. So in the first couple of minutes, we talked about there's this precipitous drop-off attributable to trauma. This is referred to as the trauma phase. And the reason why this is important is because it's absolutely essential to remember that every single person who is avalanched or buried in an avalanche that is extricated is to be, they have life-threatening trauma until proven otherwise. And they need to be addressed as a trauma patient each and every time, including spinal precautions, etc. The second phase of the survival curve is what's called the asphyxia phase. And now this is an important one because this is the 10 to 30 minute range of survivability. And this is fully dependent, the rate at which people asphyxiate is fully dependent on the patency of an airway. The only way you cannot asphyxiate is if you have a patent airway. And the survivability and the degree or the rate at which he dies from asphyxia is related to the size and presence of an air pocket. And when I say air pocket, I mean specifically anatomic air pocket in the snow. And sometimes these can be very small. And what that does is it causes a rebreathing of your own air and ultimately hypercapnia and hypoxemia and ultimately respiratory failure. Now, the rate at which this occurs is different for each patient depending on the patency of their airway and the size of their air pocket. There has been case reports of people surviving even days and weeks because they have large air pockets that are actually communicating with the external environment, and they have a constant source of oxygen. So this is an important phase, and this is important to recognize that when you extricate a buried avalanche victim, airway is your number one problem. If they're still viable, they're asphyxiating. The last part of the curve, you see a long plateau of survivability that goes on past 30 minutes, and now you're looking at a 10% survival, and 90% of people will be dead by this point. And basically, this is called the Triple H phase, in which the patient is got an air pocket, they're ventilating and oxygenating, but now they're subject to hypothermia, hypercapnia, and hypoxemia, and on top of possibly a traumatic injury. So this is kind of how to think about these patients, and it tells you a couple things. Number one is that everyone's a trauma patient. Number two, you need to get this patient extricated and ventilated and oxygenated within 10 to 30 minutes. Okay, so how can we prevent avalanche fatalities? The morbidity and mortality from avalanche burial is huge. We just looked at a curve that showed us that 80% of people were dead in 30 minutes that are buried. That is a terrible statistic. So how can we prevent avalanche fatalities? The first thing is to understand how to rescue an avalanche victim. And again, back to the avalanche curve, we learned that time is of the essence, and so the reality is that organized rescue, albeit an incredible feat, they deploy, they have to dispatch, they have to deploy. The average time for an organized rescue to extricate and unbury a avalanche victim is 150 minutes. And now we know by looking at the survival curve that almost zero of those patients are going to be alive at that time, and so that's largely body recovery. So we need to rely on our partners and our friends and our companions to rescue us, and therefore we all need to know what's going on. We all need to know the latest technologies and techniques of how to localize and unbury avalanche victims and how to resuscitate them. So the essential equipment, I think, today in 2018 for any backcountry traveler, any backcountry user of any sort is a transceiver or a beacon, which is a radio frequency transmitter that has both a search and a transmit function, a avalanche probe, which is an aluminum telescoping device that is used to probe through the deep levels of the snow and can generally and fairly accurately detect differences in the density of the snow. So when you find your victim using your beacon, you can probe around to find where their body is and more accurately decide where to dig. And then essential is the simple snow shovel, which is basically the most advanced piece of technology that we have. And all of these things need to be on your person when you're in the backcountry, and you need to know how to use each and every one of them. Now, I would be remiss if I did not bring this up, the Avalanche bag. This is kind of the new kid on the block. And this is an interesting device. It's essentially based on the theory of granular convection, in that in a particulate moving body mass, the larger particles will come up to the top, sort of the breakfast cereal theory, or the Brazil nut theory, and you have a bowl of nuts and the largest nuts will end up on top. This is not meant as so much a flotation device as it is meant to bring you up to the top of the avalanche, and if it's kind enough to deposit you on top, you're more, or shallow, you're more likely to be able to be rescued. That said, there's a little bit of data that suggests that these may actually reduce mortality, but there are also a number of reports of people who are later extricated and they have deployed their avalanche bag, and it has simply been popped or deflated by the debris in the avalanche. So I carry one of these with me almost always. Okay, so let's talk about the beacon, because this is the device that's going to actually reduce mortality in avalanche burials and fully buried victims. The beacon has a transmit device which sends out a signal, and it also has a mode in which you can turn into a search mode, and the beacon allows you to actually to pick up the signal of the buried victim and actually pinpoint it via a series of mechanisms in following that signal. And we'll go over that a little bit more in a bit. But this is the most important technological advance in avalanche safety, I would argue. So locating the victim with the beacon requires a little bit of knowledge of both strategy and tactic, but also how to use your beacon. You need to be able to turn the beacon into search mode, and then you need to do what's called a signal search, in which you have to cover large areas, sometimes because the signal only goes about 40 to 60 meters, depending on which device you have. And so you have to traverse the avalanche debris field and waiting until you can pick up the signal. And then as you get closer, the signal becomes more accurate and more clear, and then you can pinpoint your victim on the snow surface. The other thing about digging, once you do identify the victim by using your beacon and your probe, the next and huge time sink is actually digging the victim out, because there are tons and tons of snow on top of this patient, and you need to follow some there are some very specific tactics on how to dig efficiently, because this can be a huge time sink. And so they basically say, rather than standing on top of your victim and digging down right where you get your probe strike, that does a couple things. Number one, it can aggravate traumatic injuries in the victim. Number two, you're going to collapse snow on top of the victim, perhaps occluding an air pocket that's there. And so they basically teach people nowadays, I believe universally, to back off about at 1.5 times the depth of your victim, down in a downhill from the victim, and start to dig laterally into the victim, and to set up sort of a assembly line with any of your partners to help to dig the snow back and out in a V-shaped pattern, instead of digging down and making your hole too deep. Anyway, there are tactics which have shown great efficiency on how to dig these holes. Okay, so last minute here, we're going to talk a little bit about the avalanche scenario, the medicine scenario, because this is super complex. I mean, if you end up with a victim who is buried for any appreciable amount of time, who has survived the trauma phase, you are looking at somebody who is in respiratory failure, becoming hypothermic, and someone who, it's a very complex medical scenario, particularly given the probable underlying trauma and possible ongoing hemorrhage and everything else. So it's a really dicey situation, and you, at any given time, you're going to have trauma, asphyxiation, and hypothermia working, either one or all of them, trying to kill your patient. So the first, and I think the most important things about this, is once you identify and localize and extricate your victim, when you are digging, your goal, your mission is to dig out the airway. The airway needs to be opened and needs to be made patent, and if you have supplemental oxygen, that needs to be given right off the bat. The first step is to find, dig, and extricate the airway, and to begin to give positive pressure breaths if needed. And then secondarily, continue to dig out the chest for a patient who is in cardiac arrest, to begin chest compressions second. So you often need to be giving breaths and positive pressure and oxygen to a patient prior to fully unburying them. And similarly, then you may have to remove the chest and begin CPR while they are still buried in the event of a cardiac arrest. Okay, and that's all we really need to say. The third and most important point is, after you get breathing and circulation under control, you need to fully unbury the patient. You need to fully address, do a full secondary survey to find the trauma, because there's going to be trauma. They're going to have something broken. They're going to have something bleeding, and you need to protect their C-spine. You need to fully extricate them, find the trauma, and keep them warm, and and get them out of there into a critical care facility. Okay, so that's about all we're going to talk about today, and then we're going to branch off into some small groups here and do some beacon exercises. And I do want to shout out to the local Avalanche centers. These are pivotal for communities like ours with all the backcountry use. They give out stellar reports on a daily basis of the avalanche conditions, and we have one here locally called the Sierra Avalanche Center, and just down south of us on the east side of the Sierras, where a lot of us like to ski. So big props to these people. Give your local avalanche centers money, all your money. And with that, I thank you for your time.